All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really complex piece of history, the policies driving Native American displacement during the Andrew Jackson era. And we're going to view this specifically through the lens of Howard Zinn's landmark book, A People's History of the United States, zooming in on Chapter 7. It's a dense chapter, for sure, but breaking it down together is really going to help us get a grip on the hidden mechanisms of this period. So we'll be impartially breaking down Zinn's exact arguments from the text. You know how traditional history usually frames this whole era around Andrew Jackson's big political personality, right? Well, Zinn completely flips that script. He focuses way more on the underlying economic and political engines that actually drove federal policy, and he specifically centers the perspective of the people who were being displaced. Our goal today is just to figure out exactly how he builds that case. To keep us on track, here is our roadmap. 1. The foreign obstacle. 2. Expansion of cotton kingdoms. 3. Gold in Cherokee territory. 4. The Cherokee Appeal. And 5. A bitter legacy. Okay, starting off with Section 1, the foreign obstacle, focusing on paternalism and force. Before getting into the nitty-gritty timeline, Zinn sets up this fascinating theoretical framework for how the government handled different subordinate groups. He makes this really striking comparison. On one hand, you had women who were viewed as interior to society. Because their labor was literally needed inside the home, Zinn argues they were controlled mostly through patronization. But Native Americans, they were viewed as entirely exterior. Since they were needed by the expanding nation and were basically just seen as a physical obstacle in the way of it, they were dealt with using sheer brute force. It's a pretty chilling distinction, honestly. The difference between being controlled because you're deemed useful versus being removed because you're just in the way. And Zinn points out this massive, brutal paradox in the text. He writes the language of paternalism preceded the burning of villages. Basically, the federal government would use this rhetorical guise of a protective, caring father, claiming they were just doing what was best for the indigenous tribes, right before unleashing overwhelming military violence. The paternalism was literally just diplomatic cover for the force. Which brings us to Section 2, expansion of cotton kingdoms. Let's look at the hard economic motives here. Because according to Zinn, this wasn't just some inevitable, tragic clash of cultures. It was a highly calculated business maneuver. Zinn pulls in historians like Michael Rojan to show that the subjugation of the Creek Nation was deeply tied to money, specifically southwestern prosperity. The expanding cotton industry was booming, but it desperately needed land to stay profitable. So displacing indigenous populations provided that exact super valuable acreage to white planters. When you get right down to it, the economic motive was the engine, the military was just the tool. All right, moving into Section 3, gold in Cherokee territory. This economic playbook repeated itself almost perfectly in Georgia. If cotton drove the removal in one area, a totally different commodity sparked it here. It is actually wild how fast this happened. Every single event on this timeline takes place in 1829. Gold is discovered in Cherokee territory. Boom. White prospectors immediately invade and start destroying property. At first, Andrew Jackson actually sends federal troops in to stop the mining. But then, almost as quickly as he sent them, he pulls the troops back and just defers to the state of Georgia's authority. This effectively left the Cherokee with zero protection against the invaders. Zinn uses this exact sequence to prove how selective the government was about enforcing its own laws. The second a federal treaty got in the way of a sudden economic windfall like gold, that treaty was just abandoned. Now for Section 4, the Cherokee Appeal. Having looked at the colonizers and the economics, let's pivot to the human element. What makes Zinn's history so distinct is how heavily he relies on the primary sources of the oppressed. So you have to ask yourself, how did the Cherokee Nation actually react to having their land invaded and watching the federal government totally flip-flop on its policies? Well, they didn't just take it. They fought back, and they did it incredibly eloquently, using the American legal and political system itself. Zinn highlights this desperate, absolutely meticulously argued petition the Cherokee sent to the government. Their rhetorical strategy was brilliant. They basically held up a mirror to white Americans, reminding them of their own ancestors fleeing persecution in Europe. They reminded them of how Native Americans peacefully welcomed those very first starving settlers. And then they appealed directly to the Christian great law of love and basic human sympathy. They took the colonizers' own foundational myths and religious values and turned them right back around on them. This quote really hits the nail on the head. Do to others as you would that others should do to you. What's so striking here is how it cuts right through the dry political analysis to reveal a profound emotional plea. They weren't just arguing over property lines, they were arguing for their shared humanity, begging for the exact same empathy the early American settlers once needed to survive. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, a bitter legacy. We know those Cherokee appeals were ultimately ignored, which led to the Trail of Tears and decades of forced displacement. Let's look at the lasting impact of this and what the title of Zinn's chapter actually means. As long as grass grows or water runs. You might have heard that before. It sounds so poetic, right? But Zinn points out that this isn't some beautiful, romantic phrase. It's actually a chilling reminder of betrayal. This was the literal language the U.S. government used in its treaties to guarantee perpetual land rights to Native Americans. And because those treaties were systematically ripped up, the phrase has lived on through generations as the ultimate symbol of a broken promise. And this trauma didn't just stay in the 1800s. Zinn brings this right up to the modern era with a really powerful anecdote from 1970. A Native American GI, a Vietnam veteran, was testifying publicly about his own maltreatment. And right there in his testimony, he repeated that exact phrase, as long as grass grows or water runs, and broke down weeping. It just goes to show that this history isn't dead and buried. That sense of betrayal is a living reality for Indigenous communities today. So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. If history is truly written by the victors, the people who successfully cleared the land for cotton and gold, what absolutely crucial truths about our society, our economics, and our national character do we completely miss when we ignore the voices of the displaced? Looking through Zinn's lens doesn't just change how we see the 1820s, it kind of changes how we evaluate power and policy in our world right now. I hope this dive into the source material leaves you wanting to explore even more of these complex, marginalized perspectives. Thanks for sticking with me.